Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 15 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have lost 5-3. Now, some people who may be unaware of the St. Louis's situation thus far this season may have thought coming into this game that the Sharks would find themselves outmatched because, of course, the Blues have historically over these past few seasons been a pretty successful or relatively successful regular season team, certainly enough to be able to make the playoffs, and they're only a few years removed from their Stanley Cup championship in 2019, which, of course, a lot of Sharks fans will remember. And yet this season the Blues have struggled out the gate. Came into tonight's game against San Jose on an 8-game losing streak, but the Sharks, being the gracious team that they are, decided to gift wrap this win to the St. Louis Blues. Decide, you know what, you guys, you need the win more than us. 8 losses in a row is pretty bad, so here you go. Take it, as the San Jose Sharks dropped this one. Now, all jokes aside, this was actually a relatively close game, I would say. The Sharks fell behind multiple times in this one, and almost every single time, except the one where it eventually ended up mattering, they managed to make the comeback. Honestly, it's been a pretty stark contrast between the San Jose Sharks now and the San Jose Sharks back at the beginning of the season. They have once again found themselves on a pretty sizable losing streak at this point, even if you count the fact that they did technically get points in their 3 straight shootout losses. They still did lose those games, and yet each of those games have been pretty close, pretty interesting to watch. That Lightning game that ended up being decided just in the last minute or so of regulation, the couple of Ducks games that went to the shootout, the Panthers game that went to the shootout here tonight as well, which would have been a 1-goal game if not for the empty netter scored by Noel Acciari at the end of it. And so the Sharks have been looking a lot more lively than they did earlier on in the season, and they've been looking a lot more like the San Jose Sharks of last season, not just in terms of sort of how the games have gone, but also how the players on the team have played. Earlier on in the season, it was essentially the Sharks' bottom 6 that was carrying the load of the offense, which was a major reason why there really wasn't much offense for the San Jose Sharks. If you didn't have like a Nico Sturm goal, pretty much nobody was scoring goals. Now, similar to what it was last season, the Sharks are pretty much heavily leaning on this top line that features the duo of Meier and Hertl, and Labanc riding along on the coattails, and it is the bottom 6, and you could even potentially expand that to the bottom 9 that isn't necessarily pulling their weight, which is causing the San Jose Sharks to sort of lose out on the edge in a lot of these games. Now, this one starts off in the first period with a Torrey Krug goal, but it is then tied up off of a Timo Meier goal, which was technically a Justin Falk goal, as once again a opposing team player managed to score on themselves to get the Sharks back into the game, tied it up at 1. In the second period, Kyrou would score a rare power play goal against the Sharks' really top-notch penalty kill to get the Blues the lead back. The Sharks would tie it once more from Hertl. Then the Blues late in the second period, a goal from Brandon Saad would make it 3-2. In the third, the Sharks would tie it for the third time. Logan Couture would get that one off of a tip from an Erik Karlsson shot pass. But eventually the Blues would once again take the lead, and they would finally hold on to that one 4-3 and eventually 5-3. The Sharks did pull the goaltender, and honestly, I feel as though their 6-on-5 play thus far this season has seen an improvement from last year. I feel as though it has been more solid, but here tonight it didn't manage to get the job done. While they did hold zone possession for a decent while, they never actually managed to get an actual decent chance on net to actually challenge Jordan Binnington, and eventually Acciari in those last few seconds gets the empty netter and the Sharks lose it 5-3. So on to the players to talk about. Like I mentioned, it's really over these past few games been the Sharks top line carrying the majority of the offense, and that did not change here tonight. 2 of the 3 goals, of course, involved this line. Meier scored 1, Hertl scored 1. Labanc actually has been doing a decent job of things. A couple of issues in the defensive zone, which is always going to happen with Labanc, and to be fair, does occasionally happen with players like Meier and Hertl on this top line as well. So it is a bit more excusable when you're also managing to put up a couple of those assists. But he seems at the moment to be this sort of short-term solution to a pretty unsolvable problem, at least with the 12 players or the 13 players that the Sharks are currently having up on the main roster. He seems seems to be the short-term solution to this issue of who is going to play with Meier and Hertl on the first line. Has not been doing too bad of a job of it most of the time that he has been here. But once we move past the first line, this is where we begin to have these issues, because the second line, even though it's fun to have Matt Nieto here and say, ha ha ha, Couture wanted to play with Matt Nieto in this situation, it is certainly not an optimal situation, and this short-term solution that David Quinn implemented a few games ago has kind of run its course at this point. But again, it is once more in a kind of unsolvable type of problem, because the Sharks just do not have the possible player to move here. And so Couture and Barabanov, they looked decent enough here tonight, but without any sort of compliment. Like Labanc at the very least is you doing a small compliment to Hertl and Meier as a duo, plus Hertl and Meier are just better than either Barabanov or Couture. The second line doesn't necessarily manage to get too much off the ground. They did score a goal here today that should be mentioned, but a lot of that was the hard work of course, Erik Karlsson, that really managed to generate this play and this opportunity for Logan Couture to score. When it comes to the third line, I begin to feel kind of bad for Nico Sturm at this point. Sturm, when he originally started here with the San Jose Sharks, game 1 of the season, he found himself on the fourth line. He was playing with Evgeny Svechnikov. I believe it was also Gadjevich at the time, and he was able to excel in that fourth line role. He faces off against other teams' fourth lines. He's got Svechnikov by his side, who was surprisingly solid, and so Nico Sturm was able to dominate pretty significantly while he was on the ice, even if it was for brief moments of ice time. But because of that early season domination that he showed off, David Quinn has seriously expanded his role thus far. Not only did it eventually get moved up, promoted to that third line, but now he's been put in a sort of situation where he's kind of put with like the island of misfit wingers, as he's supposed to like rehab these two players on his line. Luke Kunin, who's just been like an absolute sort of anchor for many players at this point thus far this season, 15 games in, and Lindblom, who has been like the invisible man, Fantastic Four style, as a winger thus far with the San Jose Sharks, and then sort of Nico Sturm here, who has been solid thus far for the San Jose Sharks. It's kind of hard when you're carrying two players like that to really appear that great. And so there were a couple of good shifts in the offensive zone for this third line. Kunin had an opportunity early on. Lindblom, I believe, had like one good shift where I remembered that he existed. And then, of course, in the third period, we saw Sturm just barely miss the net for a fourth game-tying goal here tonight. But otherwise, this line spent a lot of time in the defensive zone, and how could I potentially really blame Nico Sturm for this type of situation? Yes, it's not as though he's completely without fault. It's not as though he's been absolutely amazing and then these two players are just awful, but he looked a lot better earlier on, and the main thing that changed were his two line mates going from pretty competent for their roles as fourth liners to pretty incompetent for their roles as third liners. And then finally, we had the fourth line. Bonino demoted down here to fourth line center. We're really getting there. We're really getting close to him being a healthy scratch, but we're not quite there yet. And he is joined by Noah Gregor and Yona Gadjevich. Once more, Svechnikov is the scratch here. I would say healthy scratch, but I refuse to believe that this guy is completely healthy, because it just doesn't make sense to me why he's not actually playing any games at this point with how well he did start the season. But who am I to say? I'm not an NHL coach, so I'll continue to say, I guess, healthy scratch in this situation. Honestly, I didn't think this fourth line was too awful. They had a couple of decent offensive zone shifts. I actually thought the best player on this line was probably Gadjevich, which is saying a lot for me because I'm not a huge fan of Gadjevich, which is what most people know, but he did actually have a couple of okay looks, not really great opportunities for the Sharks to be able to actually score goals. It would have still surprised me if one of these three players actually got a goal here tonight, but when it comes to a fourth line, while it's not at Nico Sturm level, it is still better than what we have seen at times last season, where the fourth line was really in dire straits. And then when it comes onto the defensive side of things, I want to focus in onto this top pairing. Once again, Erik Karlsson is driving the majority of the offense for the San Jose Sharks. This comes as no surprise to anybody. When he is on the ice, the San Jose Sharks are mostly playing in the offensive zone, and when they're in the defensive zone, it usually quickly moves points to the offensive zone. He's been setting up all of these plays. He had a couple of assists once again here tonight. I believe that puts him at 21 points on the season, still a decent bit ahead of the point per game pace of just 15 games. So Karlsson just continues this absolute dominance for the San Jose Sharks, has been one of the best players, not just on the San Jose Sharks, where he's really been the best player for them, but he's been one of the best players in the entire league as he is attempting to single-handedly carry the Sharks to some of these wins. And yet, because the rest of the team has kind of been failing him, the Sharks still sit 3-9-3 right near the bottom. However, Karlsson might not be able to do all of this if not for his steady defensive partner Jacob Megna, who has been paired with Karlsson over these past few games. Megna was a player who surprised me last season. At the end of it, when I was doing my end of season grades, I ended up giving Megna, I believe, a B+, maybe a B, but I believe a B+, because he came kind of out of nowhere, out of the AHL, and was actually a rather steady defensive player for the Sharks, especially once Middleton had been traded at the trade deadline. He stepped in and actually filled a decent spot in the Sharks' top 4, and he's once again doing that with Erik Karlsson. They don't want to put Ferraro in this situation because they kind of want to spread the love a bit through the lineup, and Vlasic is the similar situation. And so having Megna here, and Karlsson likes to play with Megna, and Megna is probably the most reserved of the defensemen here on the San Jose Sharks. We've seen at times Shemek jump into the play, Ferraro, but Megna, that's not really his game, and so he finds a very, very nice home here with Erik Karlsson because, of course, Karlsson's going to be the one jumping into the play, and Megna doesn't really have to concern himself with those things. It's not as though he never does it. I remember a couple of games ago he did step up, and that really caught me by surprise that it was Megna taking that great shot and not Karlsson, but he definitely gets to take it a bit more easy on the offensive side of things, but of course then has to take a bit more of a role on the defensive side of things, and he's been doing a decent job at that. Finally, we will get to the goaltending here tonight. Kaapo Kähkönen, and this was actually one of the reasons why the Sharks end up losing here tonight. 3 goals is not necessarily always enough to win in today's NHL, especially these past couple of seasons where scoring has kind of gone way up. 3 goals isn't necessarily enough compared to 5-6 seasons ago, where usually coaches would say, if we get 3 goals, we're probably going to win. But still, this was a game where Kähkönen probably could have had a couple of these goals. The sod one does deflect off of Ferraro's stick, but still kind of a fluttering one that he probably could have had. The Rosen one is similar. So it's a situation where Kähkönen wasn't completely terrible. I'm not saying it was entirely his fault, but it was a situation where with, above average to good goaltending, the Sharks probably could at the very least brought this game into overtime, but it just didn't end up happening. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action as they'll play again tomorrow against the Dallas Stars. While the St. Louis Blues have struggled coming into this game against the Sharks with 8 straight losses, the Dallas Stars have been very strong thus far this season. So we'll see if the Sharks can actually manage to break out of their losing streak, or if they'll just add another one to it. Class dismissed.